welcome to tonight's event. We're so glad that you're here. Tonight's event is Crafting a Story of Illness, and this is part of a series from Bellevue Literary Review entitled Conversations in Craft in Healthcare. And so we're really interested in talking to other people who write about illness from various perspectives, be it the healthcare worker, the patient, the family member, or the person who's been experiencing it themselves from any one of the various angles. And so thank you so much for coming. A quick and important thank you to Northwell Health, who helped support this event to make it free and available to everyone. And also a thank you to many of you who signed up. Close to 1,000 people signed up. Many of you chipped in $5 or $10 or $20 to help fund the project. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. So if you don't know Bellevue Literary Review, this is the journal. It's an actual journal, and we publish fiction, poetry, and nonfiction about health, illness, and healing. And next year will be our 25th anniversary. If you can believe, we've been at it now for a quarter of a century. And the journal comes out twice a year in print and digital. In fact, the fall issue is coming out right now. If you haven't become a subscriber, go ahead and do that. You'll get to read great literature. You'll help support a wonderful project. BLR also has many other aspects as well, including a writing workshop that is coming in January. We also will have an ongoing writing studio year-round, as well as a Facebook writing group. So those links will end up in the chat, and you'll see them in the email after the event. So please consider joining some of them. I think you'll really, really enjoy them. So why crafting a story of illness? Why do we come with this topic? And I think that illness obviously is so universal. Certainly everyone on this call has been, privy to many aspects of illness. And because of its universality, we all kind of wonder how to grapple with this. It's very vulnerable. It can be very frightening. It can be very new, unusual. It can change our lives. And writing is one of the ways that many people come to it. And now at BLR, as an editor, we get something like 5,000 submissions a year of poetry, fiction, nonfiction, showing just the interest in this. But there's always a difference between a moving experience and a moving piece of writing. And I think it's something that people struggle with quite a bit. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about today with our panelists. I will just say, if you have questions for the panel, please put them in the Q&A. The chat is for the audience, so introduce yourselves. I see it going. Say where you're from, who you are, what you do. Be nice to each other. There's nothing that's going to be monitored there. So have a good time and make some new friends in the chat. So today we are so pleased to be welcomed by Sandeep Jahar, a cardiologist and writer and a former Bellevue colleague of mine. Teresa Brown, who has been an oncology nurse and hospice nurse, and Rana Awdish, who is pulmonary critical care. And myself, I'm Danielle Ofrey. I'm the editor-in-chief of Bellevue Literary Review, and I'm an internal medicine primary care doctor. And I think all of us have written about illness in a number of ways, as patients, as doctors and nurses, as family members, and as just people, as general members of society. And there's sort of lots to say about that. So what I thought we would start with, one of the questions that comes up a lot is sort of, how do people come to writing in the middle of a very busy, healthcare career? And Sandeep, maybe I'll tee you up first. How did you come to be writing in the midst of a busy cardiology fellowship?
Right. So the writing started a bit earlier. So I write fairly frequently for the New York Times, and I'll just tell very briefly the story of how I actually connected with the New York Times, because maybe that'll be instructive for aspiring writers who are on the call. So quickly, I had a father who was a major advocate for science and pragmatism. So when I would tell him when I was a kid that I enjoyed writing, he would sort of say, well, that's fine, but what are you going to do for your career? And he wanted me to become a doctor. And I eventually decided to go to medical school, actually midway through through graduate school. I was at Berkeley, and I was studying physics, and eventually got into med school. And the summer before I went to med school, I got a fellowship at the Mass at Time Magazine. It was a mass media fellowship, and it was a great time. It was the summer before I started med school, and when I left Time, I asked the bureau chief if I could call on journalists in the future, anyone he knew who might be interested in mentoring a medical writer. And he gave me some names of some journalists, and he also gave me a name at the New York Times. And I in medical school, I just sort of cold called this guy, and it turned out he grew up in St. Louis, which is where I was, and that's probably the only reason why he actually talked to me. And he invited me to come out to New York next time to have coffee with him. So I booked a flight to New York when I was in medical school and went and spoke to him. And I tell that story because I mean, well, he wasn't so nice when I actually met him. He was a lot nicer on the phone. But I tell that story because he introduced me to Libby Rosenthal, who actually did read my stuff when I was in med school and encouraged me. But the point is that I had no idea that what I was doing, reaching out to a senior editor at the New York Times as a med student with no clips, no writing, no published writing, was actually incredibly stupid. But I did it anyway because I didn't know better. And so that's one thing I would encourage the folks out there is that, if you really want to do something, reach out, cold call, do whatever you can to get in the door, because it's the hardest really part of publishing is really getting the first piece published, I feel. And then also there's serendipity. This editor happened to live or grow up in St. Louis, and that's the only reason he talked to me. So you can count on serendipity also, but you have to give it a shot.
Thank you. And I'll just add serendipity and how we met and became writing partners. So when my first year as an attending, Sandeep was a cardiology fellow, and the cardiology clinic was at 2 South of the hospital, and medicine was 2 West. And on Wednesday afternoons, there was always one extra fellow that had to go around the corner to the medicine side. And so Sandeep got the short straw, ended up around the corner, and I was the last medicine attending on there. And so we ended up being next door neighbors on Wednesday afternoons in clinic. Got to talking. Sunday was starting his first book. I had a writing group with another writing friend, and so he joined, and we worked together for quite a few years, I think through at least 2 of your books. So serendipity, absolutely.
Yes.
Teresa, how did you come from nursing to writing?
Yeah, good question. So I actually have a PhD in English and taught English in college for a few years, and then had kids and decided I wanted a completely different career. And obviously there's a much longer version of this story, but I went back to school and became a nurse, and never really thought I would be writing as a nurse. And then one day I had a very bad experience that I think is very, very common among nurses and doctors, but a patient who was set to be discharged. This was on an oncology floor. So she was going to be going home in a few hours, actually started coughing up blood, and she died. And there's nothing in school that prepares you for this kind of event. And I couldn't shake it. I mean, I kept going to work, but so I thought, well, I'm going to write this down because that'll get it out of my head and onto paper, which does not resolve trauma, I will tell people. But I liked what I wrote. And so, like Sandeep, I thought, aim high. I've always wanted something in the New York Times. I'm going to send this to the New York Times. And to my great surprise, the Science Times, the Tuesday section of the Science Times said, we want this. It's like, oh, I was over the moon. And then people should know it took them 6 months, literally 6 months to publish it. And I had just given up. And the editor emailed me and said, we are finally publishing your piece. And then actually, they made a big deal of it. They had a photographer come out who took these incredibly spooky pictures of me. The piece is called Perhaps Death is Proud, More Reason to Save Her Life. If you want to look up and see these pictures of me looking like incredibly somber and serious. They told him I was not allowed to smile. But the piece came out, and then serendipity, yeah, it got this huge amount of attention that I didn't expect. And what I started hearing from people was, this is a voice we never hear, the voice of a bedside nurse. So I say, right person, right place, right time. And suddenly I was a nurse who writes about healthcare.
I think it's very important. I think there are a lot of voices that aren't heard. I mean, there's a bit of an epidemic of doctor writers out there, but not as many nurse writers and not as many physical therapy writers, physician assistant writers. Many more voices, I think, are waiting to be heard. So thank you for that, Teresa. Rana, tell us a bit about your story getting into writing.
Yeah, thank you. Part of the epidemic of physician writers. I got very critically ill at the end of my fellowship training. I had a tumor that ruptured in my liver that sent me into hemorrhagic shock. I had a pregnancy loss, multi-system organ failure, and just found myself in my own ICU, having completed 14 years of post-secondary education and thinking I knew what I needed to know to take care of patients, and then seeing it from the exact opposite side of the bed and realizing that there were so many gaps. And really, my first act coming back was just creating a communication curriculum for our trainees at Henry Ford Health and working to educate them on the things that I had seen and heard that I felt were unhealing or adding unnecessary suffering. And I got really tired of every time I started a course telling the whole story of my near-death experience and critical illness. And I thought, you know what? Maybe if I write it, I can just like hand it to them and I'll never have to talk about it again. And that didn't work out at all. What it turns out, when you write a book, you end up talking about it more, but it did give me something that I could share as a way of saying, this is why it's so important to me that we act different in medicine and that we learn different ways of communicating. Um, I also think it was a process of sense making for me, confronted with a very ill body. I had a choice of trying to live inside that body or moving into my head. And as a physician, it was far more comfortable to try to make sense of an incomprehensible situation and just retreat and be a little mini anthropologist and study my surroundings and not feel any of the feelings. So it was an interesting first pass.
Thank you for that. And I'll just add, for me, I did an MD PhD program. I was heading toward neurology. And then I remember the patient who changed the course of my career. And he was a guy with endocarditis who didn't have the wherewithal to get home antibiotics. So he had to get 6 weeks in the hospital. And I, the intern, had to go every single day and do an EKG, listen to his lungs. And of course, we would chat. And I got to know this guy. And he was someone, maybe he was undomiciled, he was a substance user, perhaps not the most, likable kind of patient on the wards. But as I got to know him over 8 weeks, I was just fascinated by how people tick. And so I switched to internal medicine from that. And then after my residency finished, I took off 18 months and traveled around doing some locum tenens, temp work for doctors, traveled in between trying to learn Spanish. And really in those 18 months, began to write down all the stories that I remember thinking, I'll never be this close to these kind of stories with this intensity before. And I wasn't trying to write a book. I just wanted to put them somewhere. And I will never use the term closure. I find that a little too pat, but they had to go somewhere. And so that's where they went. And they ended up, getting published and becoming a book. So that's everyone's path here. So I would like to start, and maybe Teresa, I'll start with you. What have you found most challenging when writing about illness? It's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, it's not. And I will say, as a working nurse, one thing that was also really hard was thinking about HIPAA, writing for the New York Times and being accused of violating HIPAA, which I did not do. Comment sections have all kinds of things in them. So that's a sort of like big picture system issue that I hadn't really thought about at all when I started writing. But I think in terms of capturing the experience of illness, and if people don't know Virginia Woolf's essay on being ill, it's really great, where she starts out by saying, it's amazing but of course it's Virginia Woolf, so much better than I'm going to say it, but that the effect that illness has on our life, that, there are no novels about influenza, there are no epic poems about typhus. And it's just a really great essay that I actually taught when I was teaching English. But so the really hard thing, I think, as a clinician is trying to be really honest about what is the patient's experience, which of course I will never fully know because I'm not inhabiting their body. And so it's sort of bridging that gap between them and me. And trying to really.
But then you became a patient.
Right.
You were
Yes.
already
Yes.
a writer. How was switching roles in terms of your writing, not just the experience of being a patient?
Right. Well, as Rana said, hard. Like I wrote my book Healing about being a breast cancer patient, and very similar to what Rana said. When I became a patient, I suddenly realized how inhumane a lot of our healthcare is. And so I wanted to write a book about that gap between times when I realized once I became a patient how badly I had failed patients. And I thought I had made it okay, but I probably didn't. But the question is, how do you handle that? Because we're always going to be failing our patients at times. So, what sort of distance do we have to have? But the other thing is, I was a pretty angry patient. And so just my writing about breast cancer was just a lot more emotional than my writing as a nurse had been. And I thought writing the book would be healing. The book is called Healing, and it was in a lot of ways. But then in promoting the book, I was constantly telling the story of my breast cancer diagnosis and treatment over and over and over again. And I had not thought about that. I'm glad I wrote the book. I'm very proud of it. But that was hard, and I had not anticipated that challenge.
Yeah. So Rana, so you were not a writer before you had your illness. How was it to write about your own illness?
I approached it a little bit as discovery of just pressing on some of the memories to see what it would reveal to me. I wrote quite a distance from the events themselves, so I had some space. I had processed a lot of it, and I really thought that there was more to learn than I could have learned in the moment. I think what was most difficult for me was untangling my own beliefs from that of medicine, because medicine's such a process of acculturation, identity formation. I felt that I believed things that maybe I didn't actually believe. It was like this surrogate conscience of medicine that believed that my sick body wasn't worthy, or that I somehow wasn't whole because I was, had a stroke and couldn't walk straight and couldn't talk. And I had to really unravel what was me. And that was surprising. I didn't realize that medicine had kind of infiltrated in that way.
Interesting. Now, Sandeep, your first couple of books you wrote as a doctor, as a cardiologist, but your last book you wrote as a family caregiver. What was that experience like?
Yeah, in my first couple books, like Intern or Doctor, especially Heart, I think, I was writing about patients, and often patients with whom I had relatively glancing contact, as an intern, taking care of them, for a couple of days on the wards or for a few hours in the ER. And I found that to be I found that to be easier in some ways than writing about my father. I think, well, in part, just the glancing contact. I didn't really have a relationship with many of these patients, so it was easier in some way to sort of disguise their identity because I had only met them for a very short time. And also, in intern, I mean, a lot of the book is based in the hospital. So I was writing about acute illness. And acute illness tends to have a sort of, narrative arc built in. It starts, there's a lot of drama, a lot of stuff happens, and then there's some resolution. So I think it lends itself more easily to writing about it. What I found with writing about my father is, well, one, I was writing from the perspective of a son. That was challenging. That was different because I was experiencing grief. And I also wanted to maintain a certain dispassion, in writing. The book is partly science, writing as a doctor or scientist, but then a lot of it, as you pointed out, is about caregiving. But I would say that the biggest challenge was that, when you're writing about someone with chronic illness, especially dementia, like not a lot happens day to day. It's like, it's a very slow moving. And so how do you craft that into a story? I found that to be challenging. And ultimately I realized that really the story was about me. A lot was happening inside me in watching my father, but not a lot was happening with him. And so once I made that realization, which is probably obvious to you, Danielle, but it wasn't to me at the beginning. Then it was easier to write, but it was incredibly challenging because you're writing about someone you love.
Right. I think what you point to is finding the heart of a story, of a narrative. It's not as easy as it sounds. We think the
Yeah.
story is about breast cancer, dementia, an ICU stay, and that may be the frame. But finding the heart, the sort of beating pulse of the story, is often quite different. And as someone who moved from inpatient to outpatient, again, I lost all the drama of the inpatients, and because outpatient, I mean, how exciting is blood pressure checks? We do a lot of them, but sometimes the pulse of the story is not just about the illness, and it's about either the relationship or how the outside world infiltrates into the clinician and patient relationship. There are many different things, and I think if I look back at the many drafts I've done of each piece that I've written, a lot of times it's just going around the merry-go-round until I find, that's where the heart of the story is. I think we sometimes, most of us are writing nonfiction. We're a little bit envious of fiction writers, right? They can make anything up, or poetry. But there's many fiction techniques we can use in nonfiction. And one of the things we can do a lot of is deciding where to put the frame of the story. It doesn't have to be in the plotting. This happened on day one, this happened on day two. And I think we see that a lot in beginning writers. And as people get more advanced in their writing, they may actually use this emotional through line. And in fact, the actual calendar of events may come and go, flashback, flash forward, as there's a progression of either how we grapple with the illness, our own emotional state, or some other thing. So shifting around the frame can help a lot. The other thing I always recommend, in nonfiction, you can use a lot of fictional techniques in imagining. A lot of times you can take a narrator in what might feel like a slow moving story like dementia, and the narrator can imagine what might be. What would they wish? What are they fearing? What are they dreading? These are ways to A, use fiction, and B, to sort of drive along a story that may seem like on the surface it's not moving that quickly. And having mentioned poetry, I do want to raise the issue of metaphor.
Can I just say one thing?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Danielle is an incredible editor and teacher, and I feel incredibly privileged that I was in a writing group with her. I only realized after the fact, like, what a big deal she is. But I remember when I was writing intern, I would struggle with, there was some event, and I had written maybe 3 pages, which I thought was like too long, and you would challenge me to draw it out even more and more and more. And I would say, well, this was just a short either visit or whatever. And you made the point repeatedly that there's a difference between, I forget how you put it, but there's the actual chronology, and then there's the sort of emotional chronology. And you're writing for the emotional chronology. And so that
Right,
means that a very short visit or a short experience can be pages and pages long. If it depends on how it affects you.
right. And thank you for that kind words, those kind words. I think, and probably Teresa could address this too. In great novels, there's quite an accordion-like sense of time. I often think about Atonement by Ian McEwan. If you've read that, 600-page tome, there might be a single moment that is 150 pages, and then a paragraph that takes us through 50 years. And it feels absolutely normal because that's the way we process things in our mind. And I don't know, Teresa, if you want to give us some thoughts about chronology and timing in literature.
Yeah, I think I had never quite thought about that before, but that's absolutely true. And I'm thinking about so I have twins, and when my twins were babies, I decided I'm going to read Remembrance of Things Past. If people know this enormous 3-volume work by Marcel Proust, where in English, not in French, but where a lot of nothing happens, and it's the most beautiful writing you will ever read. And I thought, this is great because this is not a book I will ever want to stay up late at night reading, never. And but at the same time, when I am reading it, I will love it. And in that book, there's 50 pages of talking about asparagus. I'm not kidding. And these beautiful descriptions. I love asparagus, but these beautiful descriptions of asparagus and what the asparagus looked like, and this sort of otherworldly asparagus, and how every night they were having asparagus. And then at the end of this 50 pages, you find out that one of the kitchen maids was allergic to asparagus, and the cook was preparing it every night to torment this poor kitchen maid because she didn't like her. And it's so beautiful and wonderful. And, you have to have a lot of patience, right? But yes. And
I
then,
would say, and
yes.
very few people can raise twin babies and read Marcel Proust at the same time. That's quite a task. But I'm going to continue on from that because I started to talk about metaphor, and there's a lot of metaphor in illness narratives. There's battle metaphors. There's journeys, burdens, and I'm wondering if any of you want to jump in. Of are those metaphors helpful? Are they a hindrance? I don't know, Rana. Have you, in writing, how did you find metaphor?
I think it's a little bit of both. Certainly, when I was shaping my illness metaphor, I fell into the sort of trap of creating a hero's journey with a narrative arc and this idea of illness to recovery as this redemption narrative, because that's medicine's most idealized view of itself. And I was really still in that cognitive framework of what was a meaningful recovery. And I hadn't done the hard work of what it meant to live in a chronically ill body with deficits. I will say, I think metaphor can serve as a bridge between two places, one of which but have a hard time explaining, and one of which is familiar to more people. I am a sucker for metaphor. We had a bat come into our house, and I was like, the bat is a metaphor. And everyone's like, for what? And I'm like, I don't know yet, but it's coming. Like, you'll see. When it was the polar vortex, and I had just had this horrible hypothermic cardiocirculatory arrest, it felt like a metaphor to me. I sort of walk through my life with that receptivity of looking for symbols. And I find it helpful in my own understanding of what I'm experiencing.
Thanks. And we read a lot of poetry for BLR. And what's interesting, because poetry is all about metaphor, is what makes a metaphor really shine. And that's when it's something unexpected and unusual. And I think one of the things we often tend to, that patient was a valiant fighter for their illness, that's a pretty familiar one, is looking for other ways that can describe it that's both enjoyable to read as just as a poetic format, but also illuminating to see an aspect of the situation that you hadn't before, because the metaphor opens that up for you. So Yes.
I mean,
So I
a
want
lot
to,
of
yes,
Oh,
go ahead.
a lot of patients will object to the use of metaphor because, you know, it may be easier for a writer. It definitely has been for me. I mean, I think there's a sentence in My Father's Brain: "It was the hardest journey I ever took," and I certainly try to. I read Illness as Metaphor, Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, and tried to make a sort of comparison between, you know, cancer and heart disease when I wrote Heart. So I think it can be useful, but I think the reason why a lot of patients object to it, and I've never written as a patient, but there's this sense that as Rana said, the journey is ennobling in some way. You know, being sick and going through that suffering is sort of ennobling or redemptive. And I think that's the problem, is when you start to fall into that trope. That I think is what patients object to, and I think readers don't really want to read.
I agree. And most patients say it just sucks. It is not nobly in any way. I'd rather
Yeah.
not have it. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can jump in too, because I also love Susan Sontag's book, Illness as Metaphor and AIDS and its Metaphors. I really, really strongly recommend them. I've read Illness as Metaphor several times. For me, writing about breast cancer, it was so hard not to fall into that language of this is a battle. And I had to monitor myself about that. And also all the pink with breast cancer and the feminizing of breast cancer. And so some of my book was picking apart these metaphors. And I was listening to you and thinking about, I felt so much like having breast cancer was like Alice through the looking glass, like an Alice in Wonderland experience. And healing, there are different moments where like Alice in Wonderland as a metaphor kind of pops up. And one that I was thinking about listening to you was, and I talked about rabbit holes and really discouraging people from going on the internet to read about their illness. And that was something I did not allow myself to do. And so, and ending up by saying a rabbit hole is a home, right? But it's also a place where you can get lost. And so it was a challenge, but a good challenge for that book to find different metaphors.
And I think it's fair as writers and clinicians that we actually interrogate those metaphors. If we use them, there's no reason we can't actually sort of explore a bit of why we're choosing this metaphor in a subtle way, not saying, oh, hey, here's now the, you know, the exposition about the metaphor, but to weave that in. That's another way when a story does not have a lot of plot, someone with a chronic illness, thinking about that metaphor and what that is part of the story. I actually was going to turn to clinical jargon. So, you know, we talk in shorthand all the time. And I think all of us here try to write for both clinicians, professionals, and the general public. How do you thread that needle of getting the explanations across of what complicated things are without sounding so condescending and explanatory?
I can jump in first. Yeah, well, having a teaching background, I often had moments in my books where I would be trying to do that teacher thing to explain things, and then my editor would say, "You sound like a professor, like stop." So then I struggled to find the right level of detail. That's one important thing, because I didn't want to get to such a level of generalization that I was actually making a statement that was untrue, you know, like about acute leukemia or a bone marrow transplant. But on the other hand, that the condition of acute leukemia and the treatment of bone marrow transplant is so incredibly complicated. It's very easy to get lost in those details, and people will get lost. It's not an interesting story, right? So that was my challenge. How do I stick to the truth, but also communicate complexity? And then I was very lucky just to have an editor with no healthcare experience, which people should think about this, because you might think you would want someone with healthcare experience. But I feel like I was very lucky that she had no healthcare experience, because I would write write things down that I thought everyone knows what this is because I was so inside that world. And she would say, what is this? Who are these people? You know? And that was great. And then I realized, oh, wow, I have a lot of blind spots. So that was another challenge. What seems normal or everyone knows this and they don't, you know, even something like talking about someone arrested or, you know, the average person, they're not going to get that that means someone died of a heart attack right then. Um, and
Yeah.
it's important for someone to say, no idea what you're talking about.
Well,
I mean,
once said
I think
I
it's
brought
also,
go ahead.
oh, sorry. I think, sometimes readers don't mind jargon. Sometimes it adds a sort of verisimilitude to the, like we see this in The Pit, right? The show about the ER in Pittsburgh, just won Best Drama. I've only watched one episode, but it's a phenomenon and people love it because unlike ER, it doesn't try to explain anything. Doctors talk the way they talk in the ER and they use jargon and they use shorthand. And so, I mean, I think piggybacking on what you were saying earlier, Danielle, I think readers want to experience emotion when they're reading. They're not reading our books to learn about medicine or, they want to sort of see the in the trenches atmosphere. And so I agree with you that sometimes jargon is lazy and can hide the emotional truth of something or can just be confusing. But at other times, like I found when I was when I was writing dialogue, that it just made more sense to me to write it the way people actually talk in the hospital.
Right. I can tell you what doesn't work. What I read often in submissions to BLRs, people will say a term and give parentheses and say this is what it is. Of course, that doesn't work because it takes
No,
you out of the narrative. And the
yeah,
way to thread the needle that I find is, as you say, Sandeep, to use the jargon the way it's spoken, and then in the actions or in the sentences that follow, convey what it is without saying what it is.
right,
Um,
right.
it's a tricky needle to thread, but it's really valuable. So you can talk about acute leukemia and then just pull it into the next sentence without having to say this is what it is. And when it comes to jargon, I will say I remember getting on a plane with my 3 young kids and they completely decompensated. And I told a friend, an English major, she's like, "Oh, that's not a word." I'm like, "Yes, it is." You can have decompensated heart failure and decompensated liver. And they said it's not English, but I think it should be because that's exactly what happens when you take a bunch of little kids on a plane. So we can bring these words right into the English language. Um, so I have another question for you guys. So um, illness unfolds often unpredictably and often with a lot of ambiguity. Um, and so how do you shape a narrative when something is so incoherent or big or like Ron, I'm going to tap you because you had an enormous experience that had 1,000 moving parts.
Mhm.
How do you create a narrative of like where you start, where do you end? Where do you draw the line between this football field of things happening?
For me, I really lean on my practice as a visual artist and the thought of framing a particular piece of it so that it can be digestible. Any of this, that we present as all is incomprehensible. But deciding what matters and what we want people to look at is part of it. I also really lean into if I find, for example, I've had surgery through the same incision 8 times. And when I'm recovering from one of those surgeries, time bends in really funny ways. And I don't know which surgery I'm recovering from. I'm not sure what age my son is. Everything gets jumbled because the pain is the same. If I try to write about that, then it's important to show that the way that time bends on itself and it is incomprehensible. And that's okay because that's part of the recovery process. And for the reader to feel a little bit of our own discombobulation, our own sense of unrealness, it serves the narrative. So I think thinking about what we want to frame and then what it's in service of are really helpful tools for me.
Yeah, I think in service of is very important. I think sometimes I'll look at a piece of writing and say, what's the drive here? Why is this
Mhm.
here? Because it's a great sentence and great vocabulary words from a thesaurus, or and so everything has to have a purpose, and you want to, hone down the story to just what's needed, but Sandeep, to expand it, where you want to give more emotional depth. But everything does have to serve some purpose. And I think that's a great way to edit one's work. Ask yourself continuously, what is the point of this paragraph, this chapter? What is it serving? How is it driving the narrative forward? What's it doing for the reader? What's it doing for the narrator? So always be in conversation about the craft of writing. Any other
I
literary
think,
techniques? Yeah.
I think it's also important when you craft the narrative to look for ways to create momentum. And, the fiction writers do it by using conflict. So when I write something that's creative nonfiction, I will look for, what were the most dramatic elements of this story? Those to me are like the major signposts that I kind of lay out. And then I know that those have to be included, because without them, the reader is just not going to be that interested. And, if we're trying to create something that's readable or artistic, I think that's super important. So I think it's about identifying the elements of drama, identifying where the conflicts are, whether within yourself or in characters who are in the story, and seeing where that goes. I think the hardest part is, where does it end? You know, and you don't want to put a bow on an experience necessarily, but I think that to me is where I've learned from reading novels.
Yes,
Why do
I will.
novels
Yeah.
work?
Yes. So I think reading fiction and poetry is very, very helpful for nonfiction. Now, I was going to ask, are there any other literary techniques that people borrow or steal from fiction or poetry that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I can. So for my second book, The Shift, so it's one day in the hospital, me as a bone marrow transplant nurse. I'd had a day where I had two patients, one of whom I was really worried about, and one of whom I wasn't worried about at all. And at some point, not to give too much away, but during the day, that changed. And the person I wasn't worried about, I needed to be really worried about. And the person I was worried about, well, I don't want to ruin it, but so I thought, okay, got this, classic, right, surprise that happens and how it evolves and how in the hospital we handled that. But then I couldn't remember anything else about that day. And so then, okay, I'm going to create a composite day. And that did have some elements of fiction, this sort of being able to pick patients, what's going to tell the best story about a day in the hospital. And so I had a patient getting discharged was one of them. And it's fascinating. It was fascinating to me how many people said to me after reading this book, you never know what people are going to take away, right? But they said, now I understand why it takes so long to get discharged from the hospital. Because the doctor's around in the morning and they say, oh, you'll be out of here by 11 o'clock. And they don't tell them that, it's the house staff who's going to be putting in their orders, and they're not going to put in the orders until they've done all their other morning stuff. It's going to be the last thing that they get to, and they're not going to leave probably before 3 p.m. And that was just so fascinating and kind of gratifying to me. But this idea of even though you're telling the truth and telling a true story, is there a way to combine elements and characters that draws on fiction? It's possible to do that.
So maybe we'll talk a little bit about issues of patient privacy. This comes up a lot. Most of us are writing nonfiction. There are HIPAA laws for patient privacy. And I'm curious, Rana, when you write for, um, mainstream media, how do you protect your patients' privacy? Do you talk to them first?
So I've been blessed with enough to write about in my own body that I very rarely write about my patients. I do feel that there is some distance there that I have a hard time bridging. I can write about my experience of caring for someone, but I can't tell that story. Um, when I have, it's usually been someone who has died of their disease and my processing around that, which, for better or worse, obviates the need for consent.
Actually, many people submitted questions in advance, and somebody asked about whether you show your writings to your patients. Have any of you done that?
Mine find them. I haven't I haven't specifically asked my patients to read it, but I've found it to be a real source of bonding when they know that I've experienced a lot of the same things that I'm asking them to go through.
For any of you, Sandeep or Teresa, have you ever asked permission from your patients to write about them? Have you written
I,
about some of your
I
patients?
haven't specifically asked for permission, but mostly what I write is about my response to what I see. Um, and in books, you can change identifying details. And so that I state right in the introduction to pretty much all my books, except my last one, which is about my dad, is that, for the sake of confidentiality, I have changed some identifying details. Again, a lot of the patients, at least in my first three books, I had relatively peripheral contact with. So I don't know if they'd remember me or, I really could identify them at this point, years later. Um, but this question of HIPAA and whatever, I mean, it comes up. I don't know. I've done a few of these panels over the years, and it always comes up, and I don't think there's any easy answer. Some people, I've heard some authors say, well, the patients I write about don't read the New York Times, or they won't read my books. That doesn't seem satisfying. Some will show the actual writing, and I think, Danielle, you have told me that you have done that before. You actually show the essay or whatever to the patients. I've never really had occasion to do that. But over the course of more than 20 years now of writing, there's only been one patient who ever really was able to identify himself. He was actually a family member and objected. One patient over 20 years, and it was terrible, and you feel horribly about it. And I did. But now, and it was an article in the New York Times, and now I'm very careful about putting in any sort of identifying detail. And in the books, it's easier because you can change the identifying details without changing the inherent truth of the experience.
Sure. And then maybe that actually leads to this discussion about what's different writing for the New York Times versus writing for a book. So you touched on one of the aspects. Teresa, do you want to add something about how that experience differs for you?
Yeah, because as you know too, when you're writing for the Times, they don't use pseudonyms. There are strict journalistic rules about how you identify people, which is why you get a lot of these columns by me or you or Sandeep that talk about the patient. Writing a book, you have so much more freedom. You can give people fake names, which is huge. And you can even, I had a few patients in my first book where I changed the gender because their gender was not germane to their illness and their treatment. Someone who's short, you can make them tall. Someone who's old, you can make them young if those details are not germane to their illness. But just to give people some advice too about observing HIPAA, in my experience, you actually have to work at it to violate HIPAA. It's everyone in healthcare knows what protected health information is. And so say writing for the New York Times, I could not add in details that were untrue to de-identify someone. I couldn't make someone with short, dark, curly hair have long blonde hair down to her waist, right? But you can leave out details. So, for example, say you have a patient who's severely overweight. If that's not germane to what's going on with them in the hospital, you can leave that out. Did they have 10 people from their family in their room with them? If those people aren't part of the story you're telling, you can leave that out. And I've discussed this with journalists and occasionally had people push back and say that's not journalism. And so to get to Sandeep's point, there is no way to do this perfectly. I'm not happy about having to say leave out people or leave out details. But on the other hand, I think it's really important to tell these stories. So it's tricky ethically and in terms of details, but it can be done. And then if you write a book, it's much, much easier.
Someone in the Q&A asked about the ethics of writing about colleagues. Have you had that, Rana?
Oh yeah. I think for me, my goal was never to have someone feel that they were recognizable. Um, I would use composite descriptions that would disguise the identity of the person to outsiders. I also went to the lengths of meeting with everyone that I did write about and say, this is what I remember. Have a read. Let's talk about it. I was surprised by how willing people were to engage in a discussion about what had happened and learn from it. I think I had some really really thoughtful colleagues who joined me in the communication work and just wanted to all be better, and it's shown a light on something. But I don't want to add shame to anyone, and I certainly wouldn't want someone to feel called out by my writing. That's never my intention, because it's about our culture and not about any one individual person's behavior. What I'm interested in is how we perpetrate the same things regardless of who we are because of how we've been acculturated.
Interesting.
Yeah. I would also say that, when I write about sort of problematic or, mistakes or anti-heroic elements in medicine, it's usually focusing on myself. And so colleagues don't mind that. So yeah, I've never seen my role as a sort of muckraking in medicine. But I just want to say one thing about the question you had about the difference between journalism and book writing. Book writing to me is a lot more fun because it can go in so many different directions, and it's the difference. I sort of struggle with: am I trying to create art, or am I trying to be an advocate for something? And when you write op-eds in the New York Times, it's usually advocacy about some point. And I think that's super important. And the Times is a huge platform, and I'm lucky to publish there. But it's not satisfying in the way that a book is, where it's just a part of you, and it's an expression of your soul. And if your goal is to create art, then I think it'll be more easily satisfied in creative nonfiction and book writing than in journalism.
Well, do you think that book writing is a form of advocacy also?
I mean, I suppose so, but I suppose there are like advocacy elements in Intern where I talk about how hard it is to be an intern, but it's not like front and center. It's really more a story, and it allows for the use of more sort of fictional or artistic elements that I think create more emotional response in the reader. I mean, number one, books are a lot longer, so you have more space to do that. But on the flip side, no one reads books, and everyone reads the New York Times. So so you're kind of like, it's a balancing act.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, my follow-up question is, do we as writers have any kind of obligation to help reduce stigma around illness? Like, is there a responsibility as you write about illness to help reduce stigma, or portray the way patients or various people in the community are experienced?
That's such a fascinating question. I really like it. And I haven't thought about it before. I will say, and dovetailing with Sandeep's unfortunate experience of the person who was angry, he wrote about them. Sometimes some of the nurses I worked with would send my columns to the patients I wrote about. And they all were so appreciative because they felt like somebody really saw them. They weren't just a nameless person sitting in a hospital bed wearing an ugly gown, but they were a human being going through something really hard. And that was so instructive to me. So I don't know, I haven't seen myself as sort of de-shaming illness, or however you might put it, but certainly elevating the role of the patient and trying to remind myself and readers and patients themselves that they're still people, they're still human beings. And that felt like a gift I could give to the people I wrote about without being aware of it.
Yeah, I mean, I can say the first couple of books I wrote, many years after things occurred. Most of the patients were either untraceable or deceased. But later on, writing in real time, when I did ask patients permission, I would say nearly all of them were so enthusiastic. They've been trying for years to tell their story and get heard in the medical system. I see a couple of comments in the chat about getting heard, but clearly we have to just thread that needle about not exploiting the patients, but trying to honor them, which I recognize is subjective, but that needs to be the North Star as we write about patients.
And one of the big drivers of stigma is just hiddenness. People don't want to talk about death. People, at least in previous generations, didn't really want to talk about illness. So I think just by virtue of writing about these things that have been relatively hidden in our culture, I think you destigmatize without necessarily purposefully, trying to do that. I think just by virtue of writing about it, you accomplish that.
I think in healthcare that we often come in contact with many segments of society that we might not in our normal non-professional lives. And I think more than many other professions. So we have this unique sort of window into meeting people we might never have come across, and and for many of these patients, they're very vulnerable populations that have been historically marginalized. And I think this can be our chance to try to humanize and be a little more democratic about who's and I see Rana, you were trying to jump in.
I was just thinking that the point that advocacy became really important for me was during the pandemic. And I think we're in another moment like that, where scientific writing and advocacy from informed thought leaders is really, really important in combating some of the misinformation. And so while I feel in some ways I'm still recovering from the advocacy from the pandemic and, advocating for visitation and for the public to understand what we were trying to accomplish with masking and segregation from diseased patients, it's even more necessary now.
Yeah, and actually, there's a question in the Q&A that maybe I'll direct to you, Sandeep, about when you're writing about a family member or a caregiving relationship, and maybe someone who can't give consent, like someone with dementia or a child. How do you handle that type of situation? Did your father know you were writing about him?
I told him, yes, my father did know. I told him that I was going to be writing about this journey. But I only came around to wanting to do that, I'd say at some point in the pandemic. So it was relatively late in the illness. But I've written about my brother in several of my books. I wrote about my father in Intern. He was a big character. My brother was, of course, a very big character in that book. And yeah, I mean, look, I think I saw somewhere in the chat, no one wants a writer in the family. I mean, I think, I mean, there's some truth to that. However, for whatever reason, my family has never objected to my writing about them. My brother has never objected to my the way I describe him, because he knows it's true. I mean, he knows that's how he is, and he doesn't really object to it at all. And my father was a character in Intern, and he had no objection. So I assumed, and of course, he was losing some capacity toward the end of his illness, but I knew from Intern, and I knew from my conversations with him that he wouldn't object. My family has actually been quite proud of my writing, rather than objecting to it or finding fault with it. So I've been lucky in that regard. I realize not every families are like that, and of course there are issues when you write about deep, dark family secrets, which I don't. But so from what I do write about, yeah, I haven't had objections.
When people ask advice about that, my typical advice is you can write about anything you want, but whether you publish it is a different conversation. So I think there's a lot in the act of writing that you may want to work out: family issues, patient issues, doctor issues, nursing issues. You may choose not to publish something if you think a patient might be hurt by that, or a colleague. It may just be the act of writing, or you write fiction. There's no reason you can't write a novel or a short story or a poem and then change as much as you want. I mean, listen, novelists from the beginning of time have their family, stitched into their books, thinly disguised. I think it's pretty hard to have a novelist in the family. I do want to ask a question that's come up in the chat and in the initial questions is, how do you guys find time to write? I mean, you're all super busy. Rana, you're an ICU doctor. When do you write?
I tend to write whatever weekends I'm not working. So I'll wake up at 4:35 in the morning, write until noon, and then the next day revise. I rarely find time during the week, but I find that by stitching weekend mornings together, it takes about 2 years to write a book.
That's it? Wow.
Oh, that
Sandeep,
feels long.
oh my gosh. Sandeep, when you're running a heart failure clinic, when do you find time to write?
Yeah, I mean, you find time for what you enjoy. I think that's always sort of, and it seems like a pat answer, but I know doctors who have avocational pursuits that are more time consuming than mine. So, yeah, it does take time. I mean, I think it's just a question of, yeah, I mean, finding the time and actually in some cases stealing time,
Ooh, that I want to hear about. Where do you steal time from? Or is that a state
well, you
secret?
steal time from, I mean, you can't do it all, right? So you decide what you're not willing to compromise. Like I wasn't willing to compromise my taking good care of my patients, but I was willing to compromise, how many patients I took on. I didn't really care about the RVUs as much as I deliberately kept my practice, I wouldn't say small, but I would say sort of medium size. And when I got pushback from the hospital or chiefs saying, you should generate more RVUs, I would say, well, I don't have the time to do that. And I was fortunate that the chiefs, mostly that I've worked with, found value in what I do. But I wasn't willing to compromise my time as a father either. So you have to just decide what it is that you're willing to compromise, and then there are actually there's time where you're not doing a lot that you can actually devote to writing. When I was writing intern, I was commuting from the Upper East Side to Long Island, and I had an hour and a half commute every day, there and back. And I was tape recording stories that I remembered, sentences that I thought I would use, observations I was making that stimulated memories about the time I was an intern. And that was all going in there, So rather than just watching The View, I was working. And then, and there are patients, sometimes they cancel and you have a half hour that you didn't expect. And, and I wouldn't go get coffee with the fellows. I would sit in my office and write. So, that's the way that you sort of steal time that, or let's say not steal time, but just be more efficient with your
I
time.
would say faculty meetings, skip faculty meetings,
Yeah, yeah,
any administrative work you can do.
yeah.
I wanted to ask, what is the best or worst writing advice you've gotten over the years? I don't know, Teresa, have you gotten any writing advice that you would share with us for good or for bad?
Yeah, well, the best advice I got was the best, and this is not original to my agent, but she's the one who told me. She said, if you want to write, you must apply the seat of the pants to the seat of the chair. And I really love that. Like, if you want to write, you have to write. There's no substitute. I would say the worst idea I've had people have about writing is that you have to write every single day. And people often ask me, do you write every single day? And no, because working 12-hour shifts, that's impossible. And I developed as a writer being very project driven. So it's like, okay, I'm writing a chapter and that's what I'm doing. And whenever I have time, I'm writing that chapter. So yeah, sit in your chair, write. Don't let anyone tell you that you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Rana, how about you? Any some writing advice?
I had a very good friend who, when she read the first draft of In Shock, told me that I had to trust my reader more because I wasn't just telling the reader what happened, I was telling them how they should feel about it. And that no one wants to be told how they should feel about the experience. I had to let them experience it. That helped me tremendously to edit out the prescriptive voice and just narrate my experience of it. The other piece of it was I had tacked on the bulletin board above my desk, if you want to write a good book, write what you don't want other people to know about you. But if you want to write a great book, write what you don't want to know about yourself. And that really helped me get honest with myself about what I was hiding or ashamed of. I didn't always put it all on the page, but it at least was a North Star.
That's great advice. Sandeep?
Yeah, I mean, I think piggybacking on what Teresa said, writing is not a culture. It's not, I mean, I have friends, colleagues who say, at some point, they might be in their 50s. At some point, I'm going to retire and I'm going to go to Paris and I'm going to go to a cafe and don a beret and start writing. But writing is not about the culture of writing. It's actually like sucks. It's about sitting in your office and struggling and being solitary and giving up a lot of what life has to offer. We do it because we like it. It's clarifying. We want to get published, whatever. But it's not about the culture. It's about actually like just doing the work. As far as the advice, Corey Dean at New York Times, when I submitted my first column, she said, "Don't be such a writer." And what she meant was, like this prose is too purplish. Like you have a great story. I was writing about, I don't know what, ICU psychosis, I think. You have a great story, it's dramatic, just tell it. Don't strain looking for metaphors and, which I think a lot of beginning writers, which I was, do. And then the other bit of advice when I signed my first book contract, my editor said, write every day. And I actually found that to be very useful, because when you're writing a book, you kind of have to live the book to make it work. And I'm astonished and jealous of Rana that she can write a book in 2 years, because all of my books have taken 3 years, almost exactly 3 years. So so it's great that you're able to do that. But I couldn't even do it in 3 years unless I wrote every day. I don't necessarily generate content every day, but I do work on it every day, whether it's editing or whatever.
I'm more like Teresa. I come and go on writing when there's time, and other things take center stage a lot. A writing teacher did say put up a post-it that says "stay seated" with an exclamation point, and to just do that. As an editor, some of the things I advise people is, do a little adverb search in your writing, because often we use adverbs as shorthand for emotions. If something happened happily or joyfully or sadly, and writing that's really because that's telling people how to feel, as you mentioned, Rana. And so looking for those, circling them, and then finding a way to convey feeling sad or feeling happy without using that word. And that's one way I think beginning writers often will use those words, and we can trim those out. I do want to extend this question to advice about getting published. So I'll start this. One of the things I think is really important is to, it's often hard to start at the New York Times. I think, Sandeep, you're an exception, but people say, I want to get published in the New Yorker or the New York Times. And I really advise people to start with a smaller horizon. Literary journals are a great place to publish. It's amazing how many people do not read submission guidelines. It's actually shocking. And so if a journal says a maximum 5,000 words, as BLR does, don't send an 8,000 word piece and think, oh, they'll love it so much they'll cut it. It's just too much. And we get that all the time. They either haven't read it or think, oh, well, my writing's so great that, and the truth is, really read the submission guidelines. I had a piece accepted at a journal, which I guess I missed the thing about no simultaneous submissions, and I got a second acceptance, and I wrote back, and they wrote back a letter and said, which part of no simultaneous submissions did you not understand? Luckily, most journals are very kind about simultaneous submissions now, but it's important. If it says submit a maximum of 3 poems, don't send 15 poems. You're really going to make someone who's working hard work even harder. So that's some of my publishing advice. Any other publishing advice?
Yeah, I just helped a young writer, sort of mentored her through finding an agent. And the thing she did get representation, but the thing I told her is you only need one person. Like, you may get 50 rejections, but if 51 believes in you and loves your book, great. Same with publishers. Of course, we all want to be the person who, like, the publishers are all having an auction about, and, there's, ridiculous amounts of money being thrown around. But all you really need is one editor, one publishing house who's committed to you and loves your work.
Yeah, and I think it's gotten really hard to get book contracts now. When I was a cardiology fellow and I got the contract for intern, I got it without a proposal. I got it after just meeting with the editor-in-chief at Farrar, Straus and Giroux at the time, who said, you don't need to write a proposal, and we're going to preempt all offers. We know you can do this, so just do it. That never happens now. Never. I got my agent when he read an article I written in the New York Times, and he reached out to me. That rarely happens now. I know really good writers who are struggling to find an agent. In fact, a friend of mine at Stanford went through 18 rejections from agents and got an agent on the 19th try, and ended up publishing a book with an incredible advance, bigger than mine. And I was very proud of her, and it was great. So I guess don't give up, but it's hard. It's gotten so hard in book publishing. I don't know if I would get published today, if I didn't have a relationship with a publishing house or an agent. So I don't know what to say about that. And I've heard various editors also say that the medical memoir genre is a little tired, and it's too many people have written it, and you need to do something else, which also kind of sucks because, you know, that's often our first book is a memoir of our training or, you know, some deep experience. So so yeah, I don't know. And as far as publishing the New York Times, I mean, you know, I don't know, but you know, people can reach out to me, and you know, if I can put you in touch with someone, I would, you know, be willing to do that. But you know, it's hard when you're submitting to a, you know, it's some generic email. You don't know if it's going to be read. From what I understand, every submission is read, but it's not necessarily read by a senior editor. It may be read by an editorial assistant or an intern. So, you know, they may have a different sensibility. So it's not easy. It's just getting harder and harder to get published, I think. I don't know if you guys find that to be the case.
I think a bit. I would add into that is also be a good literary citizen. That is, read people's books, buy them, subscribe to journals that publish the work. If you want a place for your work to be published, help keep those things afloat by actually buying and subscribing to journals and magazines and newspapers, because otherwise it's not going to be there. And I know we're coming toward the end of the hour. Any last advice, Rana or Teresa?
I would say if there are nurses out there listening, getting your voices out is so important. And, you know, it's not about having a big audience. It's about understanding that your voice matters. It really, really does. And so if you have any impulse to write, I would say write, sit on your chair and write and see what happens.
Thanks. Rana?
I would just offer that I'm the section editor for Exhalations in Chest Journal, and we accept patient narratives, family narratives, all healthcare workers across the continuum. So submit, 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 and it will find a home.
And I would add in to take a writing workshop. There's a lot of craft to learn. And I think of the early writing workshops that I took. And, you know, nobody wakes up as James Joyce except maybe James Joyce. The rest of us have to learn it all. So take some writing workshops, take some classes, work with a professional. Don't throw your first draft in and say, oh, that's going to the New Yorker. Really take some time to be very careful with what you do. And on that note, I can mention that BLR will be having its second annual writing workshop this January. And so we'll send you a link to that if you're interested. I want to give a huge thank you to Sandeep Jahar, Teresa Brown, Rana Awdish for coming tonight for this great conversation. A big thank you to the BLR team who did a lot of work in putting this together, and to Northwell Health who helped support this. We really appreciate that. I hope you will consider, you know, checking out BLR and other literary journals. Become a subscriber. You can submit your work, but also read it. Come join our Facebook writing group that's free, and you know, be on the lookout for the writing workshop. It's coming on, and please pick up the books of all the people here on the call tonight. They're all on the BLR bookshop page. Really wonderful books. I've read them all, and I can tell you they're really, really wonderful, and they're bestsellers for a good reason. So thank you all so very much for all coming tonight and sharing your evening with us, and we'll see you at the next event. Have a good night.